So I recently had a run-in with UPS, by user Chuckit Bucket. I posted this to ProRevenge but it got removed and I was told to post it here. Enjoy. UPS smashed a nearly new MacBook that I sent with them. I asked them nicely to pay me back for it and they arsed about, blaming me, blaming my packaging, saying it was impossible they damaged it etc. I was able to prove my packaging was flawless and get a statement from the Apple shop that I took it to say it was damage caused by being dropped/thrown. I could also prove it worked when I sent it. They weren't interested and messed me about for weeks, sending me from pillar to post, even threatening to make me pay interest on customs charges which I wasn't liable for as the laptop was smashed on arrival and thus worthless at import. I took it to small claims. They hired a lawyer who sent me letters saying they contested it and would go for full fees etc. if I lost. I went for it anyway. I did law stuff university so I knew the basics and I thought my case was pretty clear-cut. I won. I won my costs back, plus extra, plus interest. They ignored the court order and did not pay. Now, this laptop was originally being sent to my beloved mother-in-law. She asked me to help her with the problem as UPS were also seriously harassing her for the customs fees. However, very unexpectedly, before I could resolve it, she passed away. It was the last thing she ever asked me to do for her. I loved that woman more than pretty much any human on this planet. She was my mother, my best friend and my mentor. Taking down UPS was now my personal vendetta. I researched my options. I could have taken the usual, more conservative, legal routes to reclaim my money. But no. Fuck them. I don't care about the money anymore. I want revenge, I want drama, I want karmic justice. I went to the High Court. I got a writ of control. I, of course, added on more fees and more interest. I then hired the most aggressive bailiff firm in London. I trusted that the shitty processes and attitude of UPS to mean they would ignore the letters and actually get a visit. They did. The bailiffs rock up at UPS headquarters, and explain the situation. UPS refused to pay so the bailiffs start listing goods. Security try to make them leave, the office manager tries to bully them out. Obviously no shits are given by the bailiffs and they crack on with their jobs. I wasn't allowed the body cam footage but they did send me a detailed report. The final conclusion is copied from it below. Calls were then made to the accounts manager who arrived in a hurry. As no payment was forthcoming from them, the agent again explained the removal process and costs involved and called the office for approval to begin removals. The agent began to seize assets. The finance director then arrived on the scene. He was not at all happy about the attendance, but ultimately agreed to pay a voluntary payment in full from his personal account in order to stop the removal. I know it's a drop in the ocean to UPS, but I got more than double what I originally asked for to replace the laptop. They would have had to pay even more on top in fees to the bailiffs. I reckon it cost them at least 3x more than the original claim in the end. But mostly I just enjoy the mental image of the flustered finance director and his impotent rage, having to pay his own money to stop the heavies taking desktop computers and fancy pot plants and things out of their swanky head office lobby. Edit, this blew up. Thanks for all the awards, I can't keep up with them, but don't spend real money on me. I have no idea what it does. Stealing my GF's Wi-Fi strained, or ended, their relationship, by user Shelliser42. Hi gang. First, last time I posted here I made a dada with my story and comparing it with some of the other stories here I can only agree in hindsight. I know it means nothing on the scale of Reddit but I'm sorry about that mishap and wanted to fix my mistake. Then my GF reminded me of this story today. Backstory, after my girlfriend moved to her new apartment closer to both her sister and myself she obviously wanted internet. Although she isn't fully tech-savvy she does know her basics and thus explicitly asked the provider if she should be worried about admin/admin kind of Wi-Fi protection. She was assured that it was all fully safe out of the box, no admin/admin. In fact, just press a button to connect her laptop and her Wi-Fi network would be fully secured. The incident. So a few months or years later my GF started to notice that her internet speed went down. This became very apparent while video chatting with some of her family members in Japan. Like I said, my GF knows her basics, so she knew that it didn't have to be the internet connection itself, it could also be her laptop, or maybe the network cables had eroded due to age. She decided to cover as many options as possible before contacting her ISP support desk, so she asked me to help. I'm a geek and I worked within the field of ICT for over 30 years now, mostly as systems administrator but also as IT manager or CO manager, during which I'd still try to keep tabs with my colleagues and even cover shifts if the need arose. So visiting my GF and getting to show of my L33 TIT skills? Smiling face with sunglasses. It took me a moment but I discovered the issue, someone was leeching of her Wi-Fi. Technically the ISP support staff were right, this wasn't a admin/admin kind of thing anymore, it was completely randomized. Sorta. You see, on their routers the Wi-Fi password was the same as the random SSID, aka network name. What? They F. I was quite angry at both this incompetence as well as the blatant disrespect for my GF's privacy, maybe a bit too much but yeah. Sure, for some people this is only about getting internet but what many people overlook is that such leechers also gain access to your private network so basically they could also access any public Windows, or Mac, shares you may have active, not to mention any other connected devices. Fortunately my GF knew her basics, as I mentioned earlier, but I was still angry. The revenge. So I suggested something I had done earlier, let's replace this POS router for a professional device. In specific the same kind of ZYXEL router that I used at my home so that we could set up a secured VPN between ourselves and get some other nice feats as well, like a private VoIP connection. She agreed so we bought her a new router together. We're talking professional gear here, these things cost about as much as a high-end smartphone so obviously we were going to split the costs considering that a mid-level could also have helped her out. Now, even though I consider her previous router a POS I still have to admit that it did provide some very useful features, like a syslog service. It could also use USB storage so I turned on Wi-Fi logging, plugged in a large USB memory stick and then we waited for the new router to arrive. Then I got to work. First I set up my GF with a nice hidden Wi-Fi network so that no one could easily find it. Next we set up a much better security scheme and then it was time to get even with the lowlifes. I set up a second Wi-Fi network which was completely the same as the previous one but this time I throttled it down a bit so that it couldn't usurp the full bandwidth. Then I added some specific DNS overrides. DNS is a service on the internet which translates names into IP addresses, which is what your computer needs to connect to something. You may care about reddit.com, all your PC cares about are the associated IP addresses. Thing is, this service can be easily overridden. And I had studied the logs, so I knew exactly which sites the lowlives visited the most. So from now on going to banka.nl using this router would point your browser to a hardcore not very legal gay porn website. Not very legal as in, the site didn't bother asking for consent first but got you some close-up screenshots right away. Then it was time for bank.nl, I redirected that one to a shady hot scissors lesbian website. I also noticed that a certain web shop was sporadically used by the leecher so I decided to redirect that one to a relationship counseling website. When you think your spouse is cheating on you, come to us. It was around that time when I noticed that my GF's router was using a more modern firmware than I had on my router. This one also provided web redirection services. Companies can use this to redirect specific websites based on their URL to a local, or remote, web page. So, say you don't want your staff to use social media then you could just tell the router to redirect, say, facebook.com to a local web page which explained the no social media allowed policy. Much to my delight this service also supported a randomizer trigger. See, I still remembered a website from the early days of the internet, something about a goat from Sweden which was so horrible that it became a meme on its own. Seriously, a look at that picture could never be undone anymore, there's a reason I still remember the horror now and easy 30 years later. So, I looked for, and found, a replacement and then happily added that to a randomized redirection service. So every once in a while the leechers would open their favorite website, and no matter whatever kind of site they asked for they'd always end up with something completely and utterly disgusting on their screen. Then we waited. I need to point out that my girlfriend did not fully agree with some of my actions, especially when she learned of the aftermath. But, we never had an argument over this because she could also understand my POV, don't mess with my GF, and she agrees that if you trespass, even in the digital world, then all bets are off and you lost your rights to a civil solution. Don't mess with a geek, okay? The aftermath. One day my GF got home from work and noticed a huge moving van outside. She gave it no further mind but when she got to her front door she noticed that her neighbor 2 doors over was moving out. She brought this up with her direct in between neighbor a few days later and as it turns out things completely exploded over there, the shouting and accusations could even be heard through the walls. Seems the pair got into huge arguments about their rather explicit choice of websites and once the deed was done there was no room left for any kind of reasoning. One of the two even accused the other for hacking the internet because it was only after the first fallout that those goading pictures started to show up. As far we know they broke up. For the record, I regret nothing. I did remove the SSID for obvious reasons and also reset the DNS and forwarding sections, and now things are back to normal. More importantly, my GF is still very happy with the router and the extra services to this very same day of writing. She's working her way up as a 3D artist, and the knowledge that all her work will be fully kept safe after she copies her projects onto my NAS is a deal breaker for her. Seriously, you guys, always remember that when you use someone else's internet connection, this includes free services, then you're fully relying on their goodwill. Such services could be easily abused as well, either through pranking like I did, or worse. How about I redirect your bank requests to a fake login page so that I can store and / or abuse your data? Thanks for reading. Edit. Some points which people raised. This story didn't play out 30 years ago, at most 6. It was impossible for the couple to make an honest mistake. First, the Wi-Fi names, even default ones, would be far apart. ISP 151413, ISP 201413, ISP 251413, and so on. Also, unlimited plans aren't common here, so one way or the other they'd have seemed to be using zero data over the months this went on. Not to mention that their password would never have matched that of my GF's. Assuming of course they even had a subscription, or the same ISP. As for the DNS, not Udens, no, they wouldn't get to see the URL of their bank showing a PR0N website, but at best an IP address. As for me not caring at all about the aftermath. How entitled, or unreasonable, do you have to be to start accusing someone for opening up a website but then refusing to listen to further reason and instead start a major drama? If they had both opened the same website, like the online store, then it would be immediately clear as to what had happened. This also leads up to the honest mistake. If it were an honest mistake, then wouldn't one of them have called their ISP to try and prove their point of being not guilty? At the very least to complain about shoddy service? Instead they tore each other a new one. EDIT2. OMG, this post blew up beyond my expectations, even to a point where I couldn't keep up with comments anymore. I forgot a request above. TL, DR? And my stance is still the same. If you're leeching of someone else's internet connection, then the fallout is on you. I pranked them, hard, but still, I'm convinced others would have done a lot worse. Don't fuck with the valets, by user Jamshack. TL, DR at the end. For some backstory, I worked as a valet in a small coastal city in college, and the restaurants I worked for were very popular for both locals and tourists. We'd generally be busy year-round, but as the restaurants are both waterfront, spring/summer/early fall are our peak seasons per SE. The downside to these restaurants is that parking can be a huge pain in the ass. Combined, the restaurants can seat around 400 people at any given time, and can usually turn over about 2,500 seats on a busy weekend, but the parking lot can only hold about 60 to 70 cars at a time, which isn't much at all. That's why I, the valet, am there. We have about 25 to 30 designated valet spots, used to have double that amount, but I digress, and are really good about utilizing all of them efficiently so we can park as many cars as possible, thus getting as many tips as possible. Being that the valet spots are kind of in a weird spot, but really close to the restaurants and our stand, and there aren't any signs that say valet only, we usually show up a bit early and cone the spots off so people know they aren't for self-parking. Now, most people see the cones and recognize those spots are pretty clearly not available, but some people are so dumb/such assholes, that they will move the cones, and park in our spots anyways. Disclaimer, there is a parking garage for overflow parking, but people don't particularly like using it. People do this pretty regularly, and we're usually pretty cool about it. One of the valets will normally just walk up to them as they're parking and tell them that the spot is reserved for valet, and they'll usually comply. Obviously, this was not the case yesterday, or I wouldn't be writing this right now. While we were in full swing last night, some douchebag is not 100 feet from me moving a cone so he can try to sneakily take one of our spots. I was talking to a customer, so I wasn't able to immediately go tell him to not park there. After finishing up talking, I walked over to douche as he was getting out of his car and immediately knew I had encountered this exact guy trying to do this shit before. After this encounter, I knew revenge was going to be necessary. Our conversation went as follows. Me, hey man, I'm sorry but these spots are for valet only. That's why we have the cones set up. If you'd like to self-park, you can park in this main lot, pointing to full lot, or in the parking garage. Douche, but there's nowhere to fucking park in that lot and I don't want to park in the parking garage. You guys always do this shit to me. So if I valet I could just park here? That's bullshit, bro. I'm parking here whether you like it or not. I was pretty taken aback and basically just walked away, not wanting to get into a fight over a parking spot. I knew it was time this guy learned his lesson. Now, I don't have the authority to tow his car or give him a boot, and I wouldn't anyways because I'm not an asshole, but my power is in pure number of cars I have access to. Luckily, he did this at about 8 p.m. I contractually only have to be there until 10 p.m., at which time I can park the remaining cars in certain places and then leave the keys with the bartenders inside. Most nights I would stay to get the tips, but tonight, I was dropping keys. Conveniently, Douche had parked in the area where we move cars to before we drop the keys. My plan, use the valet cars to block Douche in and then leave with him having no way of leaving until the cars around him left. There was one car that would be particularly important, the one directly in front of him. I had a special car for that spot. It was owned by a restaurant employee that I knew wouldn't be off until 2 a.m. perfect. I maneuvered all the cars around him in a way that didn't make me look like I was intentionally blocking him, but in a way that made it look like I had no other choice. Everything fell into place perfectly and I could already feel a justice chub starting to form. I went inside to drop the keys and explain to the restaurant manager what happened in my revenge. She loves us and said she'd 100% have our backs, which I figured she would. I told her to text me and tell me how everything played out. This is the text I received last night at around 11 p.m. The guy just came up to me pissed. He said there was a car blocking him from leaving and that it needed to be moved immediately so he could leave. I tried to explain that you guys have to put cars there before you leave and that you even told him to not park there. I guess that made him mad so he started raising his voice at me. Bar manager saw and told me that he had been drinking for a while, which I assumed from the beginning. I told him that I couldn't, for liability reasons, allow him to drive home since he had been drinking. He got really pissed because he lives in 40-minute drive away but ended up taking an expensive Uber home. She told me she slipped in the argument that he was going to get another ride whether he liked it or not. I came. TLDR, guy parks in valet-only spot and ends up having to get an expensive Uber home and the inconvenience of having to come get his car today. Edit, just a couple things to add to clarify some things. This is a privately owned parking lot, as most parking lots are. The restaurants who owned it gave us permission to use this lot and told us where they wanted our spots to be. Just because something is open to the public doesn't mean it's not privately owned. These restaurants also did not want us towing/booting cars. 99% of the time, us going up and telling people they couldn't park there was sufficient and they would move or give us their keys and we could move their car if needed. If not, we'd bitch to them but ultimately wouldn't/couldn't do much. This happened several years ago. I've just copied and pasted the story from another instance. I no longer live in this town nor valet. There were some signs that said valet parking only, just not enough ammo. Like 2 signs for 20 to 25 spots.